Good morning, Pleasant Hope family. Thank you for joining me, Brother Ray Baker, for another installation of our community conversation. I am joined by Delegate Stephanie Smith. She is the chairwoman of the Baltimore City Delegation, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how state policy will affect Baltimore and the things that we're concerned about. Delegate Smith, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Primarily, we're interested in this one thing. What is the relationship between the state of Maryland and the budget that goes along with the state of Maryland and Baltimore City and the way that our resources are allocated to the people here in the city?
Thank you for this opportunity to share this information. It's really important. So I know a lot of times people think about city council and the city budget and how it impacts their life, but there are certain things that they use every day that they may not realize are primarily funded by the state budget. For example, public education. The Constitution for the state of Maryland requires a free and adequate public education be delivered to all of its residents. As we know, there have been challenges around the adequacy of that education, but it's important to note that the vast majority of the funding for Baltimore City Public Schools is derived from state funds. And that's not just for the operating of our schools, it's also for the capital needs of our schools. So we know that we have the oldest buildings in the state. And with those old buildings, we have issues around heating and issues around cooling. And those are issues that have been well documented in the press. But it's important to note that the state routinely does not fulfill the capital requests that are made by the city of Baltimore through its public school system to the state. It's never met in its totality. So that's one big pot, education funding. Then there's transportation. If you're utilizing buses, if you're utilizing light rail, the limited metro that is available in the greater Baltimore region, that is state supported. And as we know, there is an inadequacy in transit in the Baltimore region as you compare it to metropolitan DC in the Maryland suburbs. And that is something that many of us are looking to get more support, because through this pandemic, the actual reduction in ridership has been far lower in the Baltimore region as compared to the DC metro. And that's because so many of the people using our buses are getting to jobs as essential workers, particularly in the healthcare field. So these are folks that have not stopped going to work through this pandemic, and we need to make sure that their ability to get to work is not compromised. So transportation, education, there is some limited targeted funding from the state that addresses public safety, but not in the ways that people may think about. The Baltimore City Police Department is largely funded through municipal funds. So a lot of times we do realize that the policies are governed at the state level, but the funding for the Baltimore City Police Department does come from the residents of the city of Baltimore. But when it comes to other parts of the public safety apparatus, the folks that work inside our prisons, the folks that provide probation and parole support, and those types of staff, those are folks that are state employees. And we've seen reductions in those folks over Governor Hogan's term. And that does impact, public safety when you consider that so many people that have unfortunately died over the recent years in Baltimore City have been under the what do you call it? The support and supervision, that's the word I'm searching for, probation and parole. And when you reduce the staff that does that, you also reduce the capacity to support people as they're trying to turn their lives around.
Delegate, that was all important information. And thank you for letting our members and those watching know the relationship of funding. Because so often when people use terms like resources and things of the sort, they largely mean money. And money is an important driver of so many of these things. What is something that the city delegation is looking forward to this year around legislation that our members need to know about?
Well, I want to make a distinction clear for the members. That's really important. There are going to be bills that members of the delegation are going to take up that are going to have disproportionate impact or benefit to Baltimore City. And then there's going to be bills that only have impact on Baltimore City. And the difference between those bills is that the first set of bills that just happen to have great benefit for our city, they're going to just go to the committees that oversee them, and the whole General Assembly will vote on them. But if it only impacts Baltimore City, that type of bill must be heard within the delegation first, and that's called a local bill. And those bills, if they are not successful within the Baltimore City delegation, they cannot go further, and they will not be taken up by the broader General Assembly. So for local bills, the most common of those are alcohol bills. Those are bills where folks either need to adjust their liquor license, or need to acquire one, or need to somehow come in alignment with our state liquor laws. And that is something that is governed at the district level. I represent the 45th district. We're sitting right now in the 43rd district. So wherever your members live, their particular delegates and senators would have to introduce bills related to alcohol that would have to go through the delegation. Now, there are sometimes bills that are not related to alcohol that are taken up by the delegation, and they are commonly related to just enabling legislation, something that will enable the city of Baltimore to take action. So I'm not aware of too many alcohol bills right now, and most of the bills that I've been hearing about have been statewide in import, and will benefit Baltimore. For example, I know a few of us are sponsoring legislation that addresses the Wi-Fi challenges here. We know that the reliance on remote education across the state has exposed the areas and pockets of the state that have very limited access. We know that Baltimore City is definitely high in that number, where it's not just children that are unable to learn. It also means if their parents are fortunate enough to work from home, they are finding it hard to use online. And I think we sometimes forget our young people and not so young people trying to get higher education. If someone in the home is trying to get their coursework done at BCCC, their son is trying to get their coursework done at Baltimore City Public Schools, and their sibling is trying to provide support for their work via remote. That's a lot of strain on the internet if you're blessed enough to have it. And then if you don't have it, some of the solutions that we've come up with that are a patchwork, they sometimes only go but so far. So we really think that the state of Maryland needs to have a more comprehensive set of strategies to support the state, because currently the governor only has an office of rural broadband. And that would suggest that this problem only exists in rural America. And we believe within the delegation and across the state, there needs to be a broader strategy funded that does not only encompass a concern about rural access issues. So that's something a lot of us will be supporting.
Our congregation is largely concerned about racial equity. One of the things that we care about is, while we recognize that the church serves to provide for our soul and nourish our soul in the afterlife, we're deeply concerned about bringing the quality of our soul on earth as best and high priority and high quality as it can be. In that vein, what are some issues that are likely to land on the General Assembly's doorstep this coming session that our members need to know about?
Well, specifically as it pertains to racial equity, that's something I'm personally passionate about, because it's not enough to use the rhetoric, it has to be operationalized. And I know your congregation understands that. So specifically, a colleague of mine in Prince George's County, Delegate Jazz Lewis, he will be introducing legislation that requires an equity or racial equity analysis of the impacts of bills that are being proposed, because currently the Department of Legislative Services, they'll just assess the fiscal impact of a bill and in a very limited policy analysis of what a proposed law could do. But it's out of context to the racial reality of policy making. And often it just doesn't take into consideration how so many different systems are interacting together. So I would be supportive of Delegate Lewis's efforts in that regard, because this has to be systematic. It can't just be something that happens in a one-off fashion with certain bills. It needs to be foundational to how we look at how we produce legislation in general. There are also going to be a couple of issues that are going to require advocacy around equity and racial justice, because they're already moving. So one of the things that I'll be working on is income tax fairness. It seems generic, but we know that working class people actually pay a higher proportion of their income to support our taxes than many very well-off households. So this isn't federal, this is state. I actually had introduced this earlier in the last session, and I think, with the pandemic and everything moving so quickly, I don't think people realize how necessary it was for us to think about how we increase revenues, but not on the back of the working class and the people that are really being the most adversely impacted by this economy right now. So right now, Maryland does not have a particular tax bracket for millionaires. So someone who makes $300,000 and someone who makes $3 million are paying the same tax bracket. I believe that's unacceptable, and that there needs to be a restoration of the millionaires tax. So that's something I'll be pushing personally, because I do believe that that's important. But I'm also going to be pushing a broader reform of our tax code that really looks at how we bring relief to working families and right-size their contributions. Another issue that is really important that I've been supporting another colleague, again, in Prince George's County. I think it's important for us to work across the state, because many of these solutions are going to impact particularly Black people and not just Baltimore, but also in other parts of the state, is around how do we prepare for emergencies in the future? We should not be preparing just to get through this pandemic. We should be preparing to ensure that when future threats come, we're not always going back to square one, because we see who's bearing the brunt of the lives lost and the lives that have been impacted health-wise by COVID, disproportionately Black people and other communities of color. So right there, we need to get ahead of that. So Delegate Eric Barron, who's my counterpart, he's the chair of the Prince George's County delegation. We've been collaborating on a bill to really have real standards around preparedness, not just for pandemics, but for all types of threats. And another issue that a few of us are going to be looking at is the Maryland correctional enterprises. We know that so many of the things people are sitting on, writing on in state buildings, whether it's a desk, a chair, what have you, have been produced by folks that are incarcerated. A colleague of mine in Montgomery County, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, introduced the bill to try to get more transparency and reporting out of the activities of Maryland Correctional Enterprises. And in the review of the report that she was a real big advocate of having come out and get released, we realized that I think many of your members of this congregation would assume that the skills that people are learning with woodwork and, carpentry could become a job on the outside. That's kind of what we've been told. If you get these skills on the inside, they can transfer to real great opportunities on the outside. But when you realize that their business model is reliant upon people with the longest incarceration terms for their own sustainability, it shows that the people that are coming out in the 3 to 5 or less years maybe aren't the primary beneficiaries of this effort. And I think that's something that requires a little bit more digging to see what's happening, because we don't want to undermine the mental health needs of folks who do face long-term incarceration. We're not insensitive to that. But we also don't want it to be a bait and switch where you're saying you're going to reduce recidivism through these enterprises, and really it looks like you're making a whole lot of money off of people that are barely compensated. And I know that people have read the new Jim Crow and other related books, but this is right here in Maryland where people are barely being paid. I mean, they're not even approaching a living wage to build things that are making millions upon millions of dollars for the state. So I think that begs closer look through a lens of racial equity and justice.
I appreciate you offering all of those places of investigation. Those are important to what it is that our members need to know and ways that we need to function, particularly for our congregation and the sensibilities of the peoples in our congregation. And so we're thankful that you offer that to us. To follow on that point, how can we, the congregation, not just know these things, but be activists and advocates for the things that are important? How should we communicate to your colleagues in Prince George's County, in Montgomery County, and perhaps maybe those are folks that agree with us, but perhaps even in Carroll County, in Harford County, some of those folks who may not agree necessarily. How do we do the work of lobbying or advocating the issues that we're concerned about to your colleagues?
Well, I think, one of the places I want you to begin is by engaging with the people who directly represent you. So we have a brand new website for the Baltimore City Delegation. It's baltimorecitydelegation.com. And we can also be engaged via social media. So you can engage with us via Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook at City Delegation. On all platforms. So I just wanted to put that out there first and foremost. Now, in terms of the wider MGA, the Maryland General Assembly, please visit the Maryland General Assembly website. If you just Google Maryland General Assembly, it will come up. There's a brand new website that's been released, so I apologize for not having it committed to memory. But what's important is that you can research the committees that exist in both the House, the state. You can see the rosters of membership. You can also see not only what bills people have introduced for the 2021 session, you can see which bills they've introduced in prior sessions. As people might realize, some people have had to introduce things 2, 3, or 4 times before they've been successfully passed out of the General Assembly. There's also a Maryland General Assembly YouTube channel. So I think that's going to be particularly important for your members because most of the activity of the General Assembly will become virtual for this upcoming session as we enter unprecedented times for public health. The work of our committees and the work of the Baltimore City Delegation will all be virtual and can be viewed via that YouTube channel. One of the things that I think is probably not mentioned by many elected officials as a primary way of reaching out is I say talk about the things that matter to you on social media and tag that person. Emails are great. I think they're important to build a record to say I did reach out to you formally on this date with this letter or this set of circumstances or concerns. But no one sees that email except one other staffer or perhaps the member. But when you engage an elected official and tag them in social media, they may not always meander on social media depending on their comfort level with it, but someone who cares or works for them is likely to see that transmission, and it may register in a way that an email may not. I always say it's not an either or. I would say do both. Another thing is that I believe there are going to be so many more opportunities for people that have had difficulties making it to Annapolis during session to engage because it's remote. It's not ideal, but I do think it opens up opportunity for people who could not take a day off for work, who could not sacrifice certain things to go all the way to Annapolis to navigate the experience. Because quite frankly, you didn't even know sometimes when your bill of interest was even going to appear at the hearing. You could be there for hours upon hours hoping to lift your voice. With this, perhaps you can monitor what's going on while still engaging in your work day. So I believe it opens up some opportunities for people to be engaged. I also know that there's going to be opportunities for virtual interaction with your direct representatives, because people tend to have session check-ins with the people they represent. Those were usually done in person. It would probably be virtual. So I do know that we noted there's a divide. Everyone does have access to Wi-Fi, but I do realize that for the obstacles virtual is going to pose, it's going to be a solution for some people who otherwise couldn't be engaged when they had to do everything in person.
And so for our members who live in Baltimore City, the jurisdictions or the districts that account for Baltimore are?
They are the 40th district, which is most of West Baltimore, just to give your members an idea. 40th district is most of West Baltimore. 44A is a subset of West to Southwest Baltimore. Then there is the 45th district, which I represent, which is East Baltimore and much of Northeast Baltimore. The church is in the 43rd district, which is parts of Northeast and North Baltimore. And the 41st district, which is much of Northwest Baltimore. And then the last district would be the 46th district, which is all the communities that touch the water in downtown.
Perfect. And so if you happen to be a Baltimore City resident and you want to know which district is yours, likely, as the delegate has told us, it's going to be one of those. Delegate, we're so grateful for the time that you spent conversing with us today and talking with us and letting our members know what's important. Is there anything in specific that you would like to say to our members here at Pleasant Hope Baptist Church?
Yes, Pleasant Hope, I'm so gratified to have the opportunity to share with you the ways that you can get involved with your state legislature. I know that we're coming out of a season where people have been very focused on the activity of the federal government, but I think it's important to remember that much of the things that govern your existence will be state. So some of the things I want you to keep an eye out for is that police reform and accountability will be one of the biggest conversations in Annapolis. I do not sit on the committee of jurisdiction, which would be judiciary, but I think it's important for you to know the chair of the judiciary committee is actually a Baltimore City delegate. His name is Luke Klippinger, and he represents the 46th district. So if you have any concerns about police accountability and reform, you don't have to live in his district to lift your voices or to make those concerns known. I encourage you to reach out to him. Also, there's going to be a big emphasis on economic accountability and how we can support small businesses and individuals that have lost their jobs. We know that there are many people that are struggling to get their unemployment checks. They're struggling to get other benefits. If you or anyone in your universe has those challenges, do not let up in letting your elected officials know, because when we go back in January, we have an opportunity to really fix some of the systems that have not been serving the needs of Marylanders during this very trying time. We thank you for your belief and support of us, but most importantly, hold us accountable. Do not shy away from asking for clarity, transparency, and any type of spotlight that is needed, because we're here to serve you, and we need to be sometimes reminded of that. So thank you for this opportunity. Please visit BaltimoreCityDelegation.com so that you can figure out who represents you and that you can stay abreast of the information that's happening in the General Assembly.
And thank you, Delegate Smith, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and visit with us, our church, our little church on the side of the road in Belvedere Avenue, somewhere on the northeast side of East Baltimore, to come and talk to our members, to engage us about what we can do to bring heaven right here on earth. And so you guys be sure to log on to that website that Delegate Smith told you to, BaltimoreCityDelegation.com. Is that correct?
Correct.
BaltimoreCityDelegation.com. If I say it 3 times, 3 for the founders, 5 Big Sigma. If I say it 3 times, then we'll make sure we remember it correctly. BaltimoreCityDelegation.com. And if you forget it, it's right here. BaltimoreCityDelegation.com. Right there. So thank you, Delegate Smith, for joining us. And thank you, family from Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, for joining us for another installation of our Community Conversations. Until next time, I'm Brother Ray Baker.